Bonjour. Okay, so now is a mini lecture. And it's designed to get to the heart of what our class is thinking through and the objectives, the centrality of what we're after, identifying what we're after, and then how we can figure out procedures of getting there and illuminating our perspective, our map, our syllabus. Syllabus coming from the Latin word meaning map, a cartography, if you will, to kind of play on Katrina's poetry that she shared with us last week. Okay, the humanities. The core question here is, what is the human? What is our capacity? How do we understand that capacity? Are there dangers to certain powers that we wield and have? Are there even powers that we don't know yet that we have as human beings? Are some human beings more powerful than others? Are some human beings more capable of overcoming harsh environments than others? And also, just stepping back, kind of framing this, is there like a creator God of the universe, for example? And how do we fit into the relationship to God? Are we fundamentally different? Are we similar? In what ways? If there's no God, then what is it that brought us into being? Like, how is it that from nothing, something happened, right? How can something come from nothing? Is it even possible? Is our mental capacity to think through something emerging out of nothing even possible or not? Other questions that we would address when we're thinking through the core of the humanities is, how do we relate to ourselves? Are certain powers that we have mentally, cognitively, physically? And how do we relate to others in relationship to ourselves? And how do we relate to ourselves in relationship to others? Do we have a built-in moral responsibility in the universe to take care of and nurture our capacities to think? Or is the universe itself simply amoral, indifferent to morality and ethics? These are some of the basic questions. And then finally, other questions have to do with other living beings, sentient beings that we may or may not know yet still exist or yet exists. What's our relationship to other living beings? Do other living beings like a cow have consciousness? How do we relate to other living beings? And what about inanimate objects like stones and dirt, elements like iron? How do we relate to them? Well, these are all big sets of questions that we think through when we think about the humanities. One point of departure when you're thinking through the humanities as a subject matter of inquiry, of study, of serious focus, is how the humanities as a study is itself framed in today's academy. So one of the things that we think about when we think about the humanities is how the humanities is taught. What kind of context or environment is structured in which the humanities is itself focused on? And questions like what Henrik raised about anthropocentrism or the Anthropocene are important questions. Like, is it too self-indulgent for us to think through and reflect upon how humans have manipulated history, time, technologies over time and history, so on? Good question. When we think about the university, that is normally understood as the principal setting in which inquiry takes place, we have to keep in mind that in the modern form of the university, late 18th and early 19th century, in republics and democracies, universities were structured in a way that would allow for folks to do serious research and inquiry without being unduly influenced by certain powers in society that would undermine the ability for humans to think and advance ourselves in terms of questions that we ask and how we ask those questions. And that, I know that sounds rather benign or kind of just simple to understand, but you have to keep in mind when, for example, Thomas Jefferson, the third president of the United States, who founded the University of Virginia in 1819, a university that I went to. It's one of the first public universities in the United States, right after the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. But Jefferson was really keen on a university being able to be semi-autonomous from society. Give intellectuals the freedom to explore in ways that wouldn't harm them or bring harm to them. And Jefferson qualified the university as a way to hold in check the corporations that were established that are greedy, that have desires for profits over people, that treat people in ways that are subhuman or dangerous or threatening. And we know that the power of greed is fundamental to the human endeavor. And Jefferson saw one of his rivals was Hamilton, who was based in New York. And in Hamilton's view, the Wall Street and the financial industry should be the kind of central and most important mode or engine of society. And so it's really important for Jefferson, it was, to set aside a village, what he called the academic village, the University of Virginia, as a way of kind of protecting people so that they could do research that wasn't harmful or that didn't bring harm to them. Okay, so a protection. And this is what we call academic freedom. This is why professors have tenure. They are given tenure so that they have that freedom to explore, say, a corporation or a corrupt politician or corrupt pseudosciences like eugenics, and be able to identify that corruption, identify the problems there. Well, in today's university, the humanities is really, since the late 70s in the United States and Japan and other countries, the humanities has become more and more marginalized. Okay, and instead the STEM or science, engineering, mathematics, as well as business have come to the fore in the university of great prominence over against the humanities. And when you have universities being reformulated from within in a way that treats education as a technical training, like certification, then you basically have a university that is indebted to or a handmaiden for corporations and businesses and the economy. The humanities resists that internally, and it resists it because it explores questions about aesthetics, questions about art, architecture, art history. And it was thought that education should be valued as an end in itself. It's not a means to an end, but rather it is itself worthy of its own inquiry. Now that might seem, again, benign, but that's actually quite radical. And it's something that Aristotle in his metaphysics echoed or emphasized, that seeking knowledge, seeking truth, seeking what is real should have its own protections, and it is a value in and of itself, a value that might not be measurable in terms of money or in terms of economic production, but it's something that is so important that Aristotle even thought it divine. That the highest inquiry for Aristotle was the inquiry of God, or the first principle. What is it that animates all things? Is there a logic, a power in the universe that is imbued in all things existing? And if you're pursuing that logic, does that in some way make you part of a divine nature? Now, to a businessman or woman, they balk at this, right? This is offensive. That there is that simple intellectual inquiry is itself a kind of divinity process, even if there's no God. But it's a process of tapping into and participating in a kind of infinite procedure that doesn't have a certain conclusion, but rather its conclusion is itself built into questioning, a quest, right? And this is so important. And I think it's one of the reasons why that in the university today, the humanities is so marginalized and balked at. I'll give you an anecdote, a story. When I took a tenure track job at Rollins College in Florida in 2006, I went to the local coffee shop, and Winter Park, Florida is the city in which Rollins is presently, and has been for 100 years or whatever. And I was in line getting a coffee, and with a couple books in my hand or what have you, and this man in a kind of corporate looking banking suit was behind me, and he recognized that I was not familiar to him. I was new. So he asked me, "So what's your line of business?" And I thought to myself, well, how can I answer this? And so eventually I just said, I'm not in business. I'm actually in a professor at Rollins. And he goes, ha ha ha, that's not going to make you any money, being a professor. How pretentious are professors these days? They go to school for 10, 12 years, they get a degree, and they only make a little bit of money. Basically, he was just unfolding for me what his principal values were. And in the end, his principal values were making money and being part of the money making and creation trade. And, for me, just being kind of dismissed like that felt strange. I wasn't so much offended, but I did realize that in a wealthy community like Winter Park, if you don't own a business, or you're not part of a big business, or you don't have something of a kind of capitalist value or commodity, that you were considered to be less, you weren't in the inside of what Winter Park was designed to be. Now, I'm not speaking universally about Winter Park in general, but Winter Park does have that air to it, right? It does have that atmosphere, and there's built-in values that it tries to nurture and reproduce, namely the value of making money, capitalism, business, and so on. Wealthy cars, and of course he gets into his fancy Bentley and drives off, or whatever it is, So when we think about the humanities, we have to think through the value of this time that we have to think about human beings and our history. And in so thinking, maybe propose ways that human beings can offer different possibilities to the world in ways that the world as it is today doesn't acknowledge or doesn't want to accept. And then we sort of have to figure out, why does the world not want to accept new innovative possibilities, new ways of creating and fostering human power on the level of the intellect and physical power, technological power. Now, of course, recent technologies like AI and so on are able to machine design ways of doing intellectual work that can be far superior to human intellectual capacities in some ways. remains to be seen if, of course, you can have an actual generative brain through just AI and machine learning itself. But that's a question that we can ask later. For now, the whole point here is that as we think about the humanities, we must think about how even the study of the humanities is structured in a way that's already a kind of antagonism to a reigning ideology or the reigning value, cultural value of creating wealth, creating profits. And whether or not that system or framework of creating profits is itself beneficial to humans, to our environment, to the future, and to each other. Thanks.